Thank you. Let me, if I can have your attention, it's 1:45 and let's get started on time. David Haynes, Planning Administrator for Transportation Planning for the Atlanta Regional Commission, the ARC, will give us a Metropolitan Plan update. And I guess before David comes up, we have Janine Miller. That's not David. So Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for the interlude here.
You're good. You're good anytime you want to.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to introduce to the board, to the committee, David Haynes speaking here today. It was my idea to bring David and to bring the ARC, Atlanta Regional Commission's presentation forward today about their new long-range plan that they're working on. It was a presentation that was just made to the GRETA board, the Georgian Regional Transportation Authority. Since GRETA is approving the TIPs, the short-range plan that come out of Atlanta, I think it's really important to have that bigger, longer-term context for what's going on in Metro Atlanta, and thought it would be great for this board to hear the same presentation to understand our capital region here and this economic driver of the Southeast and the transportation planning and aspects that go into that planning. So invited ARC here. David Haynes and I go way back. He and I worked together at ARC, I think 19 years ago is when I first met and worked for David. But David's been at the Atlanta Regional Commission for more than 22 years. He has done the creation and amendment of dozens of short-range plans for Metro Atlanta. When he started at ARC in 2001, the population has grown from 2001 to today by 70%. So David has seen it all kind of grow under his feet and been part of the adjustments and new paths forward that have been created by major events in our country's history, including September 11th, the housing boom and bust, as well as the recession and the pandemic. So there's a wealth of information and perspective that David brings, and I want to bring David Haynes forward to you. David.
Thanks, Janine. Nothing like setting expectations. I thought for a second you were going to credit me with the region increasing the population by 70%. That is not my fault. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm pinch hitting at the last minute for my boss, John Orr. He's out sick today, so hopefully I will do an adequate job in his stead. So as Janine said, I want to give you a quick overview of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Short-Range Transportation Improvement Program that ARC has been working on for literally the past 4 years. We're on the threshold of adopting those new plans. And this will be a very high-level overview. It's a massive set of documents, obviously hundreds and hundreds of projects, billions of dollars worth of projects. So obviously I'm not going to do really this justice in 15 minutes or so. I'm just going to give you kind of tidbits and highlights, sort of teasers about the plan and what's in there. This is the obligatory, putting everything into context slide. ARC's vision is to create one great region, and if you look through the mission and goals, you see words like thriving communities, healthy, safe, livable, strategic investments, engagement, competitive economy. All of that is definitely in the wheelhouse of transportation and development of the transportation plan. So we see the MTP and the TIP as being core to everything that ARC does. Beyond transportation, it's kind of where everything comes home. So for those of you who may not be quite as familiar with ARC and its role as the region's Metropolitan Transportation Organization, just a few quick refresher points on what it is we do and what this document is. We have to update the long-range plan for the region that you see highlighted on the right side in blue every 4 years, and in conjunction with that, we have to update the short-range component, the TIP, every 4 years as well. So our last update was done in February of 2020, so you can do the math, and that 4-year clock is about to expire here in a couple of months. Now, the good thing is we have done what we think is a pretty good job in that interim period of keeping large parts of the plan as fresh as possible. We do quarterly administrative modifications. We do periodic amendments. In fact, we've done 8 of those since February of 2020. We work very closely with a lot of the GDOT staff to make sure that the scope, schedules, and projects are kept as current as possible. And going back to that boundary just for a second, it is a 20-county boundary, all of 13 counties and parts of 7 counties, and it's defined based on the Census Bureau's definition of the Atlanta urbanized area. So that boundary, as a result of the 2020 census, will probably be modified a little bit over the next couple of years, but for the time being, we're still going with the MPO boundary as defined based on the 2010 census. So that's what you see represented. So this slide is out of date, and I will explain, but you see kind of a condensed timeline of the past 4 years, focusing on the most recent few months, starting with that last update in February of 2020, and then fast forwarding to October. At the end of October, we released the draft documentation for public comment. We had a couple of public hearings during that comment period, and that closed a week or so ago on December 8th. And our original schedule was to adopt the updated plans next month in January. As you're probably aware, we have a new chair coming in next month. It'll be Mayor Dickens from the City of Atlanta. And because of that transition, and because there will be a lot of discussion about committee assignments and protocols and procedures and all of that, the decision was made to focus the board meeting in January on those efforts and then move the MTP and TIP adoption into February. So the slide does need to be updated. That's late breaking news, just happened in the past couple of days. We were informed of that. Okay, and again, I don't like the title of this slide. It's misleading in a way because there are certain parts of the plan through the amendments, through the administrative modifications that we have kept up to date, but it's been more incremental in nature. So what this slide is showing you is some of those components where we have done that sort of incremental update on a continual basis. Not that these things have not changed at all since 2020. So you see the Major Mobility Investment Program and arterial road capacity projects. Those that are in sort of that pipeline moving into the TIP, going through the engineering, right-of-way, and construction process. We've coordinated a lot with GDOT and also local sponsors because a lot of cities and counties have projects of that nature, the roadway capacity projects that they fund through their own means. So we've kept those projects moving forward as changes have been needed. We've continued to work on our performance-based planning process. We've developed a new dashboard to sort of consolidate where all the information is about the federally required measures and targets that GDOT has to do at a statewide level, and then we at ARC have to do at a regional level. And that has carried forward for the past couple of federal authorization bills. It started in MAP 21, carried through the FAST Act, and has now been incorporated into IJA. And then there are several core planning programs that keep chugging along in the background. We've continued with those, things like the Livable Centers Initiative, our county-based comprehensive transportation plans, and our freight cluster plans. So just a couple of quick maps. I'm not going to dwell on these. They're just here for illustrative purpose to add some graphics to the presentation. But you see there on the left side, the major capacity projects on our freeway system. So that would be the MMIP projects, plus interchange upgrades, interchange reconstructions. And on the right side, you see those capacity projects that are off the freeway system on the surface roadway network. So a lot of squiggles on the map. Here's that performance management dashboard that I showed you, and this is focused again on those federally required measures and targets. So we've got different tabs where you can look at on the roadway side, the safety, the asset management, and the system performance. And then there's also tabs for the transit side where you have asset management and transit safety data presented. And again, it breaks it out based on those statewide targets and the regional targets as well. And here's a slide about the LCI program, and we've continued to kind of evolve that program and move it more and more in the direction of linking the LCI planning and implementation to where we have high capacity transit either already in place or where such services are planned to be built in the future, because they leverage each other in terms of reducing vehicle miles of travel, reducing congestion, and all of that. So pivoting to what has gone through sort of a fundamental rethinking since 2020, and these are the parts of the plan that you really don't want to do sort of piecemeal. You have to kind of take a step back, clear the decks, and rebuild it from the ground up. And first and foremost is trying to incorporate IJA, Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law bill. You probably know as much about this as I do. Increased the federal funding through 2027 pretty substantially, not only on the formula program side, but there's also a lot of new competitive discretionary funds that are available under IJA. And a lot of those competitive programs, transportation has now been kind of tied at the hip to things like climate change, equity, workforce development, housing affordability, energy. So it's a lot more than just a transportation bill. It's a very wide-ranging infrastructure bill, and that has really caused ARC to kind of take a step back and rethink what is our overall role as an MPO, as a planning agency. How do we kind of broaden our scope and our mission to kind of bring all of these different components of infrastructure together more holistically? COVID, obviously kind of a big deal. You know, remember that February 2020 adoption date? That was literally 1 month before that kind of blew up on us. We're still trying to figure out, you know, what are the long-term repercussions from that. You know, the shock wave hasn't quite stabilized, but obviously we think that an increased level of teleworking is here to stay. You know, we're probably moving away from a lot of jobs that can be done fully remotely, some sort of hybrid arrangement. So that appears to be sticking to some degree, but, you know, the verdict is still out about to what degree, you know, that will really last over the long term. But it's having real significant impacts on downtowns, office vacancy rates, where people live and where they work, and also on transit ridership. You know, Janine can attest to the express system. You know, their ridership is still, what, 60-some-odd% down? And the same story with MARTA and some of our other local bus systems. So they're struggling to recapture the ridership from pre-pandemic. So we have to rethink where transit is going in the future. Population and employment growth, partially because of the pandemic, but also just broader societal trends, lower fertility rates, changes in immigration patterns. We're a little less aggressive on those growth rates than we were 4 years ago. And if you kind of throw all that together and you wanted to point to one big change in the project list, in the plan, it's really that transit piece. So we've done a lot of work working with ATL on sort of focusing what our transit expansion priorities are, and in particular, what kind of modes those expansions would be. You know, what's really viable, realistic, affordable, given the amount of revenue that's available. So transportation finance story in a nutshell, obviously finance is very, very complicated, but if you had to do a sound bite for where we stand, federal, state, and local, it's pretty good. You know, things look really good right now. The federal level, like I said, IJA has significantly increased that baseline of funding that we receive. The downside, the caveat, is inflation is continuing to erode that purchasing power. So over time, that sort of shot in the arm under IJA, it dwindles, it evaporates once you get a little bit further out into the planning horizon period. And we all know the story with the Highway Trust Fund. You know, that tax hasn't been raised in 30 years now at the federal level. So they're having to dip more and more into the general the general fund to fund transportation at the federal level. State level, we've got a really solid funding program with the motor fuel taxes, the user fees, the hotel lodging fees. A little bit of uncertainty from time to time when the motor fuel tax gets suspended for various reasons, but fortunately we've been able to cover that through infusions from the general fund, so it hasn't created any sort of disruption, but it is something to just kind of, you know, be aware of, be monitoring. A little bit of vulnerability there in the event of a future economic downturn. We may not be able to continue to do that on a regular basis. At the local level, our sales tax, the SPLOS and T-SPLOS that are in place, very, very strong returns. There was a lot of concern at the beginning of the pandemic about what would happen with local revenues, and there was a little bit of a dip for a time, but those have come roaring back. The economy is still doing pretty well. So in fact, all of those projections that we're looking at, the actual collections are pretty far exceeding what was projected. When you look at the referendums and how much they forecast SPLOS would collect versus what they have been collecting, you know, they're on average running 10 to 15% above those forecasts. So that's great news. But, you know, obviously there's a lot of pressure to deliver. So we have to kind of keep our foot to the accelerator and, you know, make sure that what is promised is actually delivered. Otherwise, the public support for when those sales taxes come back up again, approval could be hurt if we don't deliver. Okay, maybe picking up the pace just a little bit. Bottom line on the plan is it is fiscally constrained. I wouldn't be here today saying we're about to adopt it if it weren't fiscally constrained. It's one of our key requirements. So this slide shows you the breakdown between those different funding levels, federal, state, local, and then a little bit of money that comes in through CIDs and other sources. The main takeaway, the main thing to kind of look at here is how dependent we are at the local level on financing our transportation investments. Local governments, the cities and counties collectively generate more than the state does, generate more than we receive from the federal government. I think that's part of the story that doesn't get told very often, but we are very, very dependent on those local sales taxes. So collectively, and everything up here is in year of expenditure dollars, so everything's adjusted for inflation. We estimate that between now and 2050, which is the horizon year of the plan, we will collect about $171 billion. And if you look at all of the commitments in the plan, the projects and programs, you see about $168 billion of commitments. So we've left ourselves a little bit of a buffer, about $3 billion. And the reason we do that is if our inflation assumption turns out to be low and we have to adjust project costs through an amendment process, or if there's some major economic development proposal where we need to bring in a supportive infrastructure project to make that development happen, we have a little bit of wiggle room to be able to adjust the project list. So we never want to fully commit every single dollar we have available. We always give ourselves that little bit of room there. Obviously, there are lots of ways that you can slice and dice that $168 billion. This slide shows, this is mode agnostic, so it's not showing you a transit breakdown versus a road breakdown versus bike ped, anything like that. What this is showing is the type of investment, and the reason I wanted to show you this, and this is the same story that we've been saying for several plan update cycles, is the bulk of that funding goes into maintenance, modernization, operations types of investments. It's about 62%. That number has stayed pretty consistent in that 60 to 65% range for several update cycles. It's because we have a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of that infrastructure is aging, needs to be maintained. needs to be modernized. So that really only leaves about 21% of the funding that's available for major system expansion. And that major system expansion, that green wedge, would include not only on the freeways and our roadway systems, but that would also be transit expansion as well. So again, this is mode agnostic. Then you see a blue wedge. Those would be projects for transportation demand management programs, bicycle and pedestrian investments. And a big chunk of that blue is to be determined. That would represent funds that come through the MPO to make investment decisions for that haven't been decided yet. So it may be that some of that blue wedge ultimately becomes green, ultimately becomes orange. So it's just sort of a placeholder for projects yet to be determined. And then the last slice that you see up there at the top, to deliver the program, obviously requires a lot of administration and overhead. So the operating budget for GDOT, your salaries, your building rent, your utilities, ARC, public works departments, planning departments, engineering departments, that collectively will cost about $18 billion through the year 2050. So that's a surprisingly large number, but it takes a lot of people to deliver these projects. All right, I mentioned TDM, the impact of COVID. We've done a lot of work in that regard over the past couple of years. We've updated our regional TDM plan. We've actually won awards for some of our stakeholder engagement, working with employers and employees to understand teleworking patterns. Here's a slide showing you those population employment forecasts, and I know the numbers are hard to read, but the top lines would be the population forecast. So you see that original projection was about 8.6 million. We're now a little under 8 million instead. So still really, really strong growth, just not quite as aggressive as we thought maybe 4 years ago. At the employment side, you know, we're pretty close. We didn't change that much. And then here's the transit expansion program. So this is all of the projects through the year 2050. The one point here is we've moved pretty decisively away from heavy rail and light rail investments, with the exception of the Beltline, the streetcar program here within the city, and putting more and more emphasis on running express buses on the managed lanes, but also doing some arterial rapid transit along some of our surface highways around the region. That's the much more cost-effective option compared to heavy rail investments. So I guess that was the point you wanted to raise. Yeah, it's the reality. It's very, very expensive to do rail. Okay, so I mentioned the federal performance targets. When we run our models, we get a lot of additional data. So this is just sort of a snapshot of some of those other metrics that we think are sort of interesting. A lot of numbers up here, and if you look across, what you're looking at are the measures on the left side, and then what that measure is in our base year model network, which is 2020. So that's more or less existing conditions. And then that 2050 build is with the plan in place versus 2050 without the plan in place. So all of the population growth, all of the employment growth still happens. We just don't expand the system. So that gives you a comparison of what that delta produces. And on surface, you know, the difference may be pretty insignificant, you know, when you look at those individual commute levels, but you aggregate that up, millions of people doing that every day, 365 days a year for 20 some odd years through the year 2050, you do generate some pretty big numbers, particularly when you look at delay, you know, in the magnitude of billions of dollars of delay savings per year, not only for the individual commuter, but also the commercial vehicles, freight and truck drivers. And then one additional slide on federal performance requirements. We also have to demonstrate that the plan is helping meet all of the federal air quality targets. So the standards and the measures are defined by the U.S. EPA, and then EPD at the state level will set what are called budgets, so that when you look at the amount of emissions produced by the transportation sector, that amount has to be below the budget that is set by EPD. So the budgets are all those orange bars, and this is really all you need to know. Our models demonstrate, are shown, our model results are shown in the blue bars. So as long as the blue bar is below the orange bar, we're golden, we're good, and then we are. And again, if that were not the case, we wouldn't be here saying that we're on the verge of adopting a plan, because this is sort of a yes, no, pass, fail kind of exercise. All right, last slide. So the process never ends. We're already looking towards the next MTP update, what we do after February. And I will say, in my 22 years of ARC, I have not seen as much planning that is in the works over the next 18 to 24 months as we have on our plate coming up. And a lot of this is driven by some of those new priorities, executive orders out of IJA/BIL. So we're in the process of updating our freight plan. We're doing a regional transportation electrification plan. You know, as more and more cars become electrically powered rather than internal combustion engines, how we make sure that we're prepared for that. You see carbon reduction, climate pollution. We've received a congressionally directed spending, not earmark, to do a transportation health access study. And then that's on top of all of the other sort of stuff that we have done and will continue to do. So there's a lot of planning that's coming up. And the bottom line is, because of that, we're going to learn a lot by the end of 2025. And we think that that might be a good time to go ahead and do sort of a second update to this one. So rather than wait the full 4 years, we think it's probably important to go ahead and capture that, rethink the plan, and accelerate that schedule, and perhaps look at something in the 24-month time period for coming back with that next plan update. So that's still to be determined, but that's kind of what we're thinking at this point. And I will end there, and I would be happy to take any questions or comments.
Any questions for David from members of the committee? He must have answered all of them. There are no questions. David, we appreciate it very much for your attendance, and if you can solve that population issue, come back and speak to us.
I will do my best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We stand adjourned.
Okay, at this time, since Ms. Lemon is not here, I'm sure she wishes she was, but I'm going to go ahead and call the Intermodal Committee to order. Today, we've got two things on our agenda. The first one is an update on the passenger rail study given by Phil Peavy, our Atlanta Branch Chief of Transit Programs. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Peavy. I'm actually the Planning and Environmental Manager. That's the old title they still got for me there. Oh, no worries. Won't be confused with Atlanta folks there. Now, so I do want to give you an update on the Atlanta-Savannah study. Before I do that, I do want to mention the FRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The bill substantially increased FRA's funding and expanded its scope, emphasizing FRA. Oops, sorry, let me get to my presentation. Emphasizing FRA's dual safety and development mission. Now, there were a number of new programs and expanded programs, and I've listed those here just to give you a little background on FRA there. Now, moving into the Atlanta-Savannah study, in April of 2022, congressionally directed spending was announced, and included in that was a federal contribution of $8 million for the Atlanta-Savannah study. Now, the funding is administered by the Federal Rail Administration. In September of 2023, FRA awarded the grant, and work has actually started on this grant now. Now, a little bit about the study objectives. The objectives include evaluating the benefits and costs of a passenger rail service between Atlanta and Savannah, focusing on financially feasible, practical solutions and implement passenger rail service, identifying and narrowing the range of service alternatives across the study area. Now, the study area encompasses 11,300 square miles. It includes cities of Atlanta, Athens, Statesboro, Milledgeville, Macon, Augusta, Savannah, just to name a few of them. And this falls in line with funding an EIS to ready the Atlanta-Savannah corridor for implementation of high-speed passenger rail service by completing the required environmental studies and preparing the service development plan. Now, this next slide gives you an example of FRA's passenger rail long-term development blueprint. Now, the Atlanta-Savannah rail study is following this blueprint, and we are currently in the service development plan piece, which is the highlighted yellow there. Now, one thing to note is the Atlanta-Savannah study is included in the Georgia State Rail Plan. Now, this is a Georgia-focused vision and needs for both freight and passenger rail. It's also included in the Southeast Regional Plan, which is a long-term multi-state passenger rail vision for the Southeast. And next, we have the FRA process. Now, the first step of this process is initiation of the scope, schedule, and service development plan cost estimate. Now, we have completed this task in cooperation with FRA, and our project started, like I mentioned, back in September of 2023. We are currently in the service development plan piece, and as part of that, we'll be working to develop service description, frequency, speed, capital project inventory. We're working on looking at rolling stock, equipment needs, FR safety and security compliance, station locations, financial plan, just to name a few of the items that we're going to be looking at as part of this study. And then once this study is completed and is accepted by, or the service delivery plan is completed and accepted by the FRA, we can then request additional funds to move into project development. Now, this schedule for this study is going to carry us into 2028, and many of the activities in the project schedule will overlap and be conducted concurrently. Now, the proposed draft schedule will evolve as the project moves along, and we'll update the schedule as needed in coordination with FRA. Now, what are we currently doing? Some of these activities, these are the activities we're currently working on in the first year of the study. All these activities will be conducted concurrently. And the first one is project work plan. We're working on developing that with the FRA. We'll be developing communication protocols, project execution plan and schedule, project coordination, QA/QC, invoicing and progress reporting, and the documentation. We'll also be working on stakeholder engagement. This includes identifying key stakeholders. Key stakeholders in a study like this will include elected officials, local governments, planning agencies, Class 1 and short line freight railroads, universities, airports, the public, and many more agencies and organizations as we move through the process. We'll also begin our initial engagement activities. This will include one-on-one stakeholder meetings, project information sheets, database of stakeholders' comments, initial stakeholder committee meetings, and many more activities just to make sure we meet with everyone that wants to have input on this study. We'll also be working on our data needs identification. This will include a data needs technical memo where we will identify anticipated data needs and sources for evaluation process. We'll also be working on preliminary data collection, where we'll capture readily available data in addition to doing a desktop level identification and inventory of the transportation and environmental resources. Now, this data plan is anticipated to carry us through the life of the project and inform on future work. This will also be a living database throughout the project, and the team will add to this database as the project evolves. And the final piece is evaluation methodology. Now, here's where we'll develop our evaluation process and criteria that will also be used throughout the entirety of the project. We'll identify a wide range of alternatives to be evaluated and refined, and with a focus on looking at some of the existing transportation corridors. Now, establishing a robust evaluation methodology criteria the onset of this project sets us up for success to manage the wide area for exploration and possible alternatives. Now, this is a tool we will use to guide the decision-making process and recommend investments at the end of this study. One last thing I would like to mention is that this past Friday, the Federal Rail Administration announced a corridor identification program participants, and the Atlanta-Savannah project was included as part of that, as well as 2 other Georgia corridors, the Charlotte, North Carolina to Atlanta corridor, as well as the Atlanta, Chattanooga, and Nashville, Memphis corridor were also selected. So we'll see a lot of Georgia corridors in this upcoming program. This concludes my presentation today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? This is very, very interesting. And would you clarify again your title, just so we know who we're hearing from?
Yes, ma'am. Planning Environmental Manager. I'm in the Division of Intermodal.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for your report. I can't wait to hear what comes of all this.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next we're going to hear about our freight rail program. Mr. Andrew Heath, our Deputy Chief Engineer.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and members of the committee, the rest of the board. It's good to be with you today to talk about a brand new funding program that the department will be rolling out here in short order. You can see by the title, it's the Georgia Locomotive Fuel Tax Program. So this presentation is intended to give you an overview of this program and sort of serve as the initiation of this program kicking off. So this is a pretty dense presentation. You'll see a lot of text pulling specifically from statute. So I wanted to kind of lay out the key facts of this presentation at the very beginning. First and foremost, it's a new rail funding program established during the 2021 legislative session. You can see the code section there in Title 48. It is tied to the criteria of the Georgia Freight Rail Program, which is a separate code section. And 1 year ago, the December board meeting 1 year ago, I talked to you a little bit about the Georgia Freight Rail Program and sort of the framework that statute lays out for this freight rail investment. It is subject to annual appropriations, and in FY24, we have our first appropriation for this program. It's a little over $7 million, and it's designed to enhance the state investment into freight rail for the public benefit. Both Class 1 rail lines and short line rail lines are eligible, and we will be formally announcing this this month to operators across the state. We'll be posting a new GDOT policy, guidance, and application documents, and then pushing all that out broadly so these operators are aware and that they can then participate in this opportunity. So just a little bit of background, and we'll circle back to this here in a minute, but just so you know sort of the overview of the freight rail system within Georgia. As you likely know, we have 2 Class 1 railroads, being Norfolk Southern and CSX, and you can see their operating miles within the state listed there. And then we have 26 Class 2, and I'm sorry, that's an issue there, 30 total Class 2 and 3 short lines, 6 GDOT owned, 24 privately owned, and you can see the breakdown there. So if you look at the number of operating miles between those 3 things, it basically divvies up to be about a third apiece, right? So 1,700, 1,600, 1,500, generally about one-third between those various categories. The highlighted lines on the map to the right, those are the GDOT-owned short lines. So this is where I said it was going to get a little bit dense, so just bear with me, but I kind of need to walk through this to show how the Title 32 Georgia Freight Railroad Program is then linked to the Locomotive Fuel Tax Program in Title 48. And I kind of highlighted sort of that key criteria where it says it's all linked to the public benefit, right? So this investment, the state enhancement and investment is linked to public benefit. So the Freight Railroad Program is designed to enhance the state investment in rail projects for the public benefit to support a safe and balanced transportation system for the state, and shall be administered subject for appropriations in order to enhance that investment. So again, highlighting that public benefit piece and laying out that framework for investment. And then subsequently, the Georgia Locomotive Fuel Tax was established to be used for freight and logistics projects defined as projects for capital, construction, and maintenance on freight rail assets. Again, linked to substantial public benefit. So I wanted to highlight those to show how those things are linked. And I can understand how that's a little bit confusing, how we've got 2 code sections dealing with this, and Josh is going to talk a little bit about this in his presentation in just a moment. But high level, if you think about how this works, Title 32 is about the infrastructure, highways and bridges. So think of that as framework. Title 48 is revenue and taxation, so think of that as the funding program, right? So in terms of how these things are linked. So again, talking about the framework and the criteria in Title 32, this slide shows sort of the eligibility of projects that are shown there. So it's kind of broken up into various categories: rail enhancement, rail preservation, and rail industrial access. But generally, it's all about investment into railways and railroad equipment, so things like rail crossings, rolling stock, right-of-way, or other facilities. But then it can also get into things of like improving industrial access. Think about rail spurs or that type of facility. So that kind of gives you the sort of the eligibility within that. I talked about public benefit. What does that mean? Well, that is actually also laid out in the statute in Title 32, and you can see these are very specifically listed, defining within this program what they mean by public benefit. So enhanced public safety, mobility of goods, reduction in crossings, things of that nature. So you get the idea of what the public benefit that we're looking for in this program actually are. So how's this going to work? All right, so I mentioned on that overview slide about how the rail operating miles are divvied up about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. What the department is going to do through this program is distribute the funds on a application-based competitive process with the distribution as follows: 67% to be to Class 1 railroads, 33% available to short line railroads, linking it back to the operating track miles in the state. Now, the reason why we're doing this is that the legislation specifically requires us to consider operating track miles in distributing those funds. So we're following that statute, we're following that guidance and rolling this out, and that's how we intend on splitting up these funds. We will be soliciting applications and standing up an internal rail program evaluation committee as established by the commissioner to solicit applications and to review them per the criteria of public benefit, as I just talked about. And then we will make selections based on those criteria. We'll then enter into a memorandum of agreement, which would set out the scope for the project, the performance requirements for the project, and provide the funding to the operators to then go carry out that project. So the program is going to be managed by the Intermodal Rail Program. Clement Solomon is here in the audience, so his staff will be taking the lead on the rail side and managing the day-to-day of this program. Again, we will be asking in the applications and the posted guidance to operators that to show us how their projects meet the required criteria and public benefit as laid out in statute. I mentioned a memorandum of agreement will be issued, and we anticipate this program occurring annually. Obviously subject to appropriations, but based on that taxation structure that I talked about, we anticipate seeing those appropriations annually, so we will renew this every year and carry out this application process every year. So here's our schedule. I talked about guidance coming out this month. We actually anticipate pushing this out on Monday to all the operators, all of this information, and then having applications due towards the end of January from the operators, so that we can target selection and the entering into memorandums of agreement in February. That is our current targeted schedule for rolling out this program. So two last things real quick. Phil covered this, but I wanted to spend a moment. These are two good news items, but Phil mentioned the Corridor ID program and how the Atlanta to Savannah rail study is following the Corridor ID program. And that was awarded, and we received notice to that on Friday. That corridor was selected as a corridor to follow that program. And in addition to the congressionally directed spending we received, that also came with $500,000 through the FRA to supplement that budget for that study as we're doing that. The Atlanta to Savannah was not the only rail line selected for Corridor ID. Phil mentioned Charlotte to Atlanta, and then Atlanta, Chattanooga, Nashville, Memphis. But what's important to understand is Atlanta to Savannah is being led by GDOT, right? The other one, as you see here, Charlotte to Atlanta, is being led by North Carolina DOT. The Atlanta to Memphis corridor is being led by the city of Chattanooga. So we will obviously be a stakeholder in those studies and be aware of what's going on, and we'll make sure that the board is aware of what's going on with those studies. But we will specifically be leading the Atlanta to Savannah effort. But all three of these were grant awardees through Corridor ID, so all three of them have been awarded this $500,000 allotment to begin that service development plan process. So just want to provide a little bit more information on that. And then one final piece of good news, this is not specific to the program I just talked about, but we were subsequently notified that GDOT has been awarded $12 million through the Multimodal Project Discretionary Grant, MPDG, to carry out a grade separation of State Route 21, the Millen Bypass, where it crosses Norfolk Southern just north of town. That grant is obviously going to allow us to advance that project as we work through design activities and get into right-of-way and construction for that project. So that was great news that we received just last week and will allow us to carry out this critically important project and alleviate some of the impacts we're seeing from block crossings in the Millen area. So obviously, just wanted to conclude with some really good news here at the end of the presentation. So that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Any questions for Mr. Heath? It doesn't look like it, but again, very interesting. Keep us up to date, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Seeing that there's no other business, this committee is adjourned.
All right, we're going to call the order the Legislative Committee, and we're going to have Mr. Josh Waller, our Director of Policy and Government Affairs, present quite a number of items. And with that, Josh, you have the floor.
Hopefully not too many, quite a number, but I'll do the best I can. So before I jump into the PowerPoint, I want to note that the special session just happened. Obviously, everyone's aware of that. And the General Assembly has passed the State House, State Senate, and congressional maps and sent those to the governor for signature. We are awaiting the judge who ordered the maps to hold a hearing on December the 20th. And then we'll see kind of where it goes from there. It could be the district court or the circuit court may ultimately weigh in, but we'll keep you updated. Additionally, during the special session, the suspension of fuel tax was ratified. So from September the 12th through November the 29th was the period of time, and motor fuel tax went back into effect on the 30th of November. So we're going to cover some new legislative items. We're at that time of the year where we look at the next session, get the board's approval for new legislative items. We'll take a look at some legislation that didn't make it across the finish line last session. We'll get an approval of the legislative agenda, and then we'll talk a little bit about the federal fiscal 24 Appropriations Act. So first thing is, the first of the new items is codifying the TRIP program, the Towing and Recovery Incentive Program, which has actually been in place for over 15 years. It's a very effective program that provides an incentive to towers to quickly get commercial vehicles, trucks, buses off the roadway in the urban interstate areas. The program relies on coordination with State Patrol, local law enforcement, our field districts, and other folks to work. And so as that program has grown and evolved, one of the things that we've identified to be helpful is to sort of codify components of that in law. So we have general authority to do it, and again, it's been in place for over 15 years. But because of the coordination required, the communication that's required, and sort of the evolution of time, there's sort of a consensus among stakeholders that maybe putting some of the components explicitly in law would be helpful. So that's what we're working with stakeholders to do, to develop that. And as we have specific language, we'll come back to the board. But that's essentially the goal. Is the program as it exists today, and we have a programmatic explanation on our website, the time task force, those kind of components being sort of enshrined more directly in law. The next item is sort of straightforward with respect to right-of-way acquisition. So when we are acquiring common property from a condominium association, we actually have to make communication with every single condo owner in that. So when I say common property, so like a green space, parking space, something that's just commonly owned, not a specific owner's property. We have to make communication with every single owner in the condominium association. This would allow us to just streamline that and deal with the governing authority, which is the condominium association, so that they would receive the communication, they'd communicate with their members, make the decision on how to proceed, really to streamline that process. So that's what that would change would do. The next item, kind of keying in on what Andrew had talked about earlier, he showed you those two different code sections, Title 32, which is obviously the code section that pretty much authorizes everything that DOT does, and then 48 is the revenue code. So you have a little bit of history there with, the General Assembly came in a few years ago and adopted a freight rail program establishing those three categories. And then subsequently, a decision was made to take the existing state sales tax on diesel fuel, locomotive diesel fuel, and dedicate it to freight and logistics projects. Andrew did a great job detailing that. So one of the things, though, is, as you do things in subsequent years and just in the legislative process, there's probably, we're going to propose a little bit of cleaning up to make a more direct reference in Title 48 to that Title 32 section so that it harmonizes, because I think that's ultimately was the intent, but it would be helpful in the statute, in the Title 48 statute, to more explicitly tie it back to Title 32. Really just a real clean reference back to that Title 32 program. So that would be the extent of that change. And then every year we'll have a line item for the Title 40 cleanup, and that's dealing with traffic code sections. So we, as sort of things pop up, and as we get some specifics, we'll bring those back to the board. So once we have legislation, we'll meet at the January meeting, February, March, and then hopefully session's not still going by the time of the April board meeting. Good Lord, please. We'll cover the recap, but we'll have that language specifically for y'all to look at once we've finalized that with all of our stakeholders. So with that, just a reminder, we had two bills that came up last session. Last session was an interesting session. Did a little bit with truck weights, if folks remember that one. And so we kind of took up a lot of the oxygen. So we still have some legislation we'll get over the finish line this session. Just as a reminder, this has already been presented to the board and approved, but a few years ago, General Assembly adopted for us some new procurement methods called 3 different ones under the heading of alternative contracting methods. Like with anything, especially new, you realize with time there's some cleanup edits that needed to be made. And so we had those on the books, as well as thinking about the interstate roadways and crashes, a provision that would make it absolutely clear that a coroner or a medical examiner, so when you have a fatality on the roadway, that coroner or medical examiner is human like every one of us, and if every way to that accident's blocked, they're going to have the same challenges that any of us would have getting there. So it would enable that coroner or medical examiner, when they're having when it's difficult for them to access this crash site because there's a fatality, to delegate someone who is of equal authority, so someone in the medical field who could perform those activities who's on site, to delegate their authority. That would assist in helping to clear the crash because the fatality has to be resolved, the declaration of death by the coroner or the designee has to occur before the full site can begin to be cleared. So that was in there. And then one other main item, you all are familiar with our quick response program, and that operates under a code section that allows for a more expedited procurement process. So it's not been adjusted for over 10 years. And at the time, it was sort of set up at $200,000. Well, time has shown that it's becoming harder and harder to get right-hand turn lanes, left turn lanes especially, other kind of similar traffic improvement, intersection improvements. And so we proposed moving that up to 500. So that was all part of last year's, technically still calendar year this year, but we'll be working on that next session as well, getting that over the finish line. So I guess I should ask, was there any questions about this slide or the previous one? Because the next one will be sort of will be the kind of seeking approval for the new items.
Any questions at this point for Josh? Ooh. Any questions? No questions.
So I think if this might be the place, if there's the 4 new items.
Yes. Yes. Unless
Chairman,
yes.
we make the motion as the whole of the whole 4. Would that be appropriate? That's for our board to approve? Well, I'd like to make that motion that we look at the new potential legislation that we wish to be introduced this coming year, the 2024 session.
Okay.
So that we can move forward on these items that were mentioned to the legislation.
All right, I have a motion from Ann, and do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Micah. Any discussion? We'll go ahead and pass it, I guess, and then Josh, you can present.
All right.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise? It's passed.
Thank you very much.
Hi,
Go ahead.
Kathy Williams.
And we have Kathy from somewhere distant. Ooh. Kathy, if you're sending that signal or not.
Yes, I vote aye. I'm on the phone.
Thank you very much. Quick transition over to the federal side. You know, again, the time of the year, Christmas trees and continuing resolutions. So the current one, so Congress has adopted a little bit of a different approach. So instead of all of the federal agencies being tied to one continuing resolution, they did two tranches. Half of them, or half-ish, are tied to January the 19th, which the U.S. Department of Transportation, all transportation funding's pegged to January the 19th. The other half are tied to Groundhog Day. So I don't know, is it better to be the 19th or Groundhog Day? I think, let's just say that 19th is going to be luckier than Groundhog Day. So that means that that's, you know, you take that pro rata share from the start of the federal fiscal year, which began October the 1st through January the 19th. You divide the total we're supposed to get by 365, multiply it by those days. That's how much that's been made available to us. So that's the federal funds we are operating on, and we will see what the future has to hold. And there's a headline from last month that I think captures particularly that sometimes we just got to be prepared for, especially in transportation, the unexpected. So I'll let it sink in a little bit there. So let's get ready for the unexpected, everybody. So with that, concludes my report.
Any questions? If not, Josh, thank you as always for the job you do, and look forward to working with you. I have a question from Dennis.
The status of the truck weight committee, study committee?
There's not a pending study committee, but the legislation they adopted that allowed for increased weights outside of the metro area was a 2-year authorization. So that will not theoretically have to be acted on one way or the other until calendar year 2025. My understanding is that generally there's a preference to allow that 2 years to play out and not have a discussion. Obviously, we will be staying on top of that and being aware and engaged in that conversation. You know, and certainly that figures a lot into our discussions with the General Assembly about investment and bridge replacements and pavement rehabilitation, and so a fulsome conversation on that, but not necessarily expecting anything until 2025.
Okay, I was mistaken. I thought there was a
there are certain aspects that are being talked about, but I think the general consensus among some that I've heard thus far is because that lasts in the 2025, that they would rather, I heard it said during the special session that a lot of folks would like to see what 2 years of data looks like before they make any future decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for Josh? Hearing none, thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee stands adjourned.
And Tim Matthews, if you would come up and give us an update on the 400 express lanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and others present. Before I give you an update on the express lane project, we do have a resolution that I'll talk about and explain what that does for your consideration throughout the presentation. But before we get into that, just to give you an update on the procurement of 400, we are in active procurement for State Route 400 express lane projects. There's lots of activities that have been going on, lots of activities that are continuing to go on. Some of those include Q&As with the shortlisted teams that are participating in the project, as well as one-on-one meetings with the department and the teams, technical questions and responses, coordination with the Build America Bureau, to name a few, and development of ATCs, which are our alternative technical concepts. We are seeing high value in innovation through these alternative technical concepts. And what I mean by that, I can't tell you what the ATCs are because we're in an active procurement, but what that really means is we see value through innovation in the ATC process by way of cost savings, potentially, schedule savings, or construction and staging practices to help with traffic control management during construction. So those are the type of things that you generally see from our base scope, that differ from our base scope. The next action, as you can see on the screen, that we'll bring before this board is the resolution that I will get into details in the next few slides. And then also the next item before the board will be the actual project agreement and the award of the best value proposer for the project in Q3 of 2024. All right, the joint resolution, just a little background. This board did approve a joint resolution last year that really allowed CERTA and GDOT to work together to deliver the State Route 400 Express Lane project. And in doing so, allows us to procure and manage the project using a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain delivery method. And the purpose of this joint resolution I'm bringing before you today is to designate lanes on State Route 400 as toll lanes, and also designate which vehicles can be exempt from the tolls on those lanes itself. So that requires action by the board and approval by the board via section 3294-C. And it's really a designated of travel lanes for the exclusive or preferential use of certain vehicles subject to the approval of the board. Now, what do we do with the toll lanes? Those are managed by CERTA by way of the Peach Pass, so you have to have a registered Peach Pass to access the lanes. But you can also access the lanes if you don't have a Peach Pass, such as neighboring states traveling through Georgia, as long as you pay the toll that get mailed to you, as well as the associated fee tied to that. Now, those tolls are subject to approval of the project agreement, which will be brought to you next year, as well as approval by the state of CERTA and executed by CERTA after award to the best value proposer. So that's really how that works. So Peach Pass users are the registered identification for the vehicle. And there is interoperability with other states such as Florida, North Carolina, and some Easy Pass states across the nation as well. So as I mentioned, that this resolution also identifies which vehicles are exempt from tolls on the express lanes. Those vehicles are public transit vehicles, and those are transit service providers that can come from the county, city, the state as a whole. Greta Express Bus Service, Cobb County Link, for example, is an example of a transit service provider. They will be registered with CERTA and have toll-free accessibility. Registered van pools that are registered with CERTA also have access to the express lanes for free of charge. Now, you still have to pay for the service provider to get into a transit service, but you don't have to pay a second fee for the tolls itself. Private motor coaches that serve the public, and emergency vehicles registered with CERTA, and emergency vehicles that are not registered with CERTA that are responding to an emergency on the express lanes themselves. So those vehicles will not have to pay that charge. Also, any vehicle containing a member of the U.S. military or Georgia National Guard with an order or certificate of an order for duty. Now, what does that mean? It means that if they're identified in the system and they don't have a Peach Pass or identification in the vehicle, they have a chance to prove that they were on official duty if they're in a vehicle that's not marked by the military or other type of identification. And also a part of this resolution, MARTA vehicles, maintenance vehicles that are marked to conduct necessary maintenance for the bus rapid transit stations along the 400 corridor. So those are the vehicles that have been identified as toll-free or exempt from the tolls on the express lanes. Sure, yeah.
Is that after the fact?
If they're not registered, then they would receive a notice in the mail.
What if they don't pay that?
There's associated process that goes behind that through CERTA to try to collect the fees and the tolls themselves.
Well, what looks like to me is anybody can use it, and if they don't pay it, we're out that money, yet we got more people on the road.
It would be up to CERTA to pursue those associated costs and fees for that particular user.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is I'm worried about the vehicles that travel on it that that are not registered. They said, okay, well, I won't be back for a couple of years, so I'm not going to pay it.
Mr. Boswell, there's a violation process for that, where CERTA or another state, if you're in another jurisdiction, can.
Yeah.
So, but the goal is to have happy customers, and the interoperability, I think, too, is make sure you understand if you have a Sun Pass or the Easy Pass or the other passes that aren't interoperable, so you're trying to do that. But every toll system has a violation process if somebody chooses not to pay, of how they choose to recover those costs plus penalty. And they're civil penalty.
Use it, I mean, unless they have the.
It would be clearly marked that you have to have a pass to use it. But there are certain numbers of violations, obviously.
Yeah.
And I think a part of that customer service commissioner mentioned was if they do use it and they're not registered and they see a benefit, ideally, they would get registered and use it into the future. So that's a part of that process.
Yeah, while you're on this topic, I have a question. On exempted vehicles, of all those exempted vehicle categories, what would you anticipate, how much volume percentage-wise might that be on these toll lanes?
I don't know a percent volume off the top of my head. I know that it's not a lot. I mean, transit service providers, currently provide accessibility to certain corridors, not all. So it would depend on the routes that they choose to use for their systems. But I don't know a percentage versus the actual number we anticipate for just normal use.
Right. On the other managed toll lanes we have, like the Northwest Corridor that's been in use for a number of years now, do we track traffic as far as what might be exempted vehicles on those existing toll lanes?
I'm not sure, but it's something we can ask CERTA. I know they track a lot of data on Northwest Corridor and the other express lane systems, and we do see a use by transit service providers on those corridors as well, so we can find out.
If there's a way to get that information, I'd be curious to know what percentage vehicles are exempted vehicles.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Just finally here, this is not unique, this resolution, to our express lane system we have, and the board has adopted this resolution in the past. As an example, the I-85 express lanes, this resolution was adopted. Also, the I-75 South Metro express lanes and the Northwest Corridor project was all, the resolution was all adopted for those projects as well. So with that, unless there are any further questions, we ask that for this committee's consideration and recommendation for approval to the full Transportation Board, the resolution on preferential or exclusive use of the State Route 400 express lanes.
Did I hear, motion? Did I have a motion? Have a second? Have a second. Any other? So, there's no other questions? We'll have a motion for approval. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carried.
Aye, Kathy Williams.
Thank you. Tim, thank you for this report, and great job. Thank you all so much. So no other questions. We'll be discontinued.
Okay. All right. We have the committee of the whole. That's Alan Davis will come forward and gives for the hero.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committees, members of the committee, members of the board commissioner. Happy to see you all here this afternoon to give you an update on the HERO program, one of the programs of the department and the Office of Traffic Operations that I'm certainly proud of. This past spring, we came and gave you an update of where the program was and shared a little bit of the challenges that the program was encountering and the things that we needed to take on. So just an overview of that. The HERO program been around since 1994, I believe, in Metro Atlanta area, is providing a vital service to travelers in the Metro Atlanta area. They really are the face of the department and the service they provide to citizens and motorist assist and incident management. Very critical in everything that they do day in and day out. But unfortunately, when we met with you last, we were having an issue with recruitment and retention within the program. Like many folks in the industry, or across the industry. We were down to, of a program where we had a budgeted almost 159 positions, we were down to 25 operators in service. This was having a huge impact to customer service, and we knew we needed to do something about it. So we put together an action plan for the unit and how to address that. And this included reduced patrol hours, reduced patrol territory, as well as an aggressive recruitment strategy. Just to cover a little bit about what that strategy was and what we took on, this was to go into effect this summer. July 1st was the target date we were going to implement this. It included about a reduction in the service patrol area of HERO to about 65% of their existing territory, and a reduction in their hours of service. HERO had been a 24/7 service since about 2014. We took that to a 5 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. Monday through Friday service for patrolling, and then on the weekend 6 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. with the overnight hours still having operators on call for those major events that come up overnight. We were backfilling that coverage territory with the CHAMP program, so we were still having active patrols throughout the CHAMP program operating from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., and they would backfill that about 135 miles. So we're still providing that service, but concentrating the HERO service area for a number of reasons, to give them a break, to be able to focus on what they needed to do to provide better quality service to their patrol area, where we had the highest percentage of crashes and motorist assist events within the area, and to give them the time to really build the unit, both from a number standpoint and a culture standpoint as well. When you're an operator out on the field, running your patrols solo all the time, the camaraderie of the unit itself can struggle in those environments. So we implemented this in July 1st of this year. So the past 6 months, though, we've been busy. What have we been up to? So in conjunction with Human Resources, we've been doing some aggressive recruiting strategies, things like going to high schools and recruiting high school graduates, other colleges and universities around, former law enforcement officials, things like that, as well as things like Indeed.com hiring events. We have gotten a huge interest and surge of applicants and pulls through that. It's been a very successful tool for us to be able to extend our reach out to. And we've been doing a lot of training on folks we've been hiring on. Part of what makes HERO, I think, great is the culture of the unit itself and the service, that the badge of honor that HERO operator carries of the service they get to provide to motorists. We want to make sure that's something within the culture that's extended out to the unit as we bring in new staff and all. And it's been a lot of hard work. So I want to share a little story about this picture you see here on the slide. It was one morning when I came into our Transportation Management Center. I walked by our main conference room where we have our Emergency Operations Center, and I saw this room full of HERO trainees. I said, look at this. That room full of trainees was full of, I think, more trainees than we had operators working on during that shift. It was a remarkable sight to see this great influx of people coming in, ready to work for the department, ready to be a member of the HERO unit and to deliver this service. But what that really translates to is where we are today. So I mentioned we were at 25 operators back in the spring. Today we are up to 81. Our first class of trainees that we brought in, particularly through an Indeed hiring events that we went through, had 55 new trainees that came into the program, which was huge. And to be honest, a bit overwhelming for the unit on the training, but we've made it happen. That first group had about 65 total new trainees, a initial wave of about 10, and then 55 in the large class. And those operators, after going through training, began service and patrolling this October. So that 81 brings in all of our trainers, current operators, and supervisors, folks out there on the road helping motorists out, working these major incidents in Metro Atlanta, and ensuring quick clearance as best we can. They've been working incredibly hard, and it's been a huge success to see this turnaround. Lots of hard work, not only from GDOT HERO staff, but also GDOT HR, making all those things happen and bringing those folks online and on board quickly. With that, I'm happy to announce that we're able to resume some resumption of the patrol routes that we had to convince from back in July. So where we're able to start resuming these patrol routes now are up I-85 up towards Gwinnett County, I-985, I-75 in Cobb County up to Chastain Road, and then I-575. Now, We've targeted those areas for a number of reasons where we can bring those online now. Some of those include where we have the number of incidents that we are responding to as a unit, staff availability and capability, and some of the logistics around that is where we felt we could bring those corridors back in for patrol routes. The modified patrol hours will remain for now from 5 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. And then the overnight on-call response does still remain. We also still have CHAMP backfilled in the rest of the areas where our patrol routes have been condensed. So just in some of those, as we've brought these operators on, I want to highlight some of the statistics and the numbers and the data that support some of the work they've been doing. We've seen events in October of 2023 compared to September 2023. The number of events that HERO has been responding to has increased by 22% in 1 month. The number of HERO detected events, so when HERO is out patrolling and they see a motorist or a crash or something on the side of the road, that's a HERO detected event. We've seen those from September 2022 to September 2023, increased from 25% from 2022 in September. And then from September 2023 to October has been an increase in 40% of those HERO detected events. So the added patrols are really having a huge impact in the service that HEROs be able to provide those motorists. And lastly, HERO assisted crashes. So HERO operators out there assisting motorists who are in a crash or something like that has increased 20% from 669 crashes in September 2022 to 802 in September 2023. So major increase in numbers and service. I think that represents the added workforce we have and the service they're able to provide. That's the core mission of what HERO does for us. Now, some of the metrics we track every month for performance measurement and how well the program's operating, highlight some of those from January 2023 compared to October 2023. Across the board, our key metrics have improved. Average arrival to scene from scene dispatch from 11 minutes on average down to 7 minutes. Time to scene from when they are dispatched reduced from almost 25 minutes down to 15 minutes. Getting lanes cleared in these events, crucial metric, is down from, was at 37 minutes on average, down to an average of 29 minutes. In that situation, every minute is tremendously valuable in how quickly we can clear those incidents. And then getting the shoulders cleared, 56 minutes down to 39 minutes. So having that added workforce, bringing these operators online has had a huge impact to the unit's performance. And then just to compare over time what that trend looks like, the last quarter you see here from July to October, we see the actual number of HERO assists increasing from 10,000 the previous quarter to over 15,000 this last quarter. And then I took this snapshot towards the end of November. So this current quarter, we're already on track to exceed our Q1 2024 numbers. We're already at almost 13,000 assists that the unit has had. So we're excited to see those numbers continue to rise and provide benefit to the public. But we still have work to do. It's a lot of success, but the unit is continuing to work hard to get back to where they want to be. Our goal for the unit is to get total personnel back up to 125. So the 81 operators, trainees, and supervisors that we had currently, we're trying to get that number up. Our target is 125, and I think the strategy that we've implemented for recruitment, retention, these innovative hiring events that we've been pulling forward will really help us to get there, and I'm excited for that. It is still our intention to resume 24-hour patrols for the unit, to get back to that, as well as the resumption of the full coverage patrol territory. We're leaning hard on our management to tell us when they feel that their operators are trained and ready to begin resuming that service. I'm sure you all know that some of the incidents that our operators respond to can get kind of crazy out there. They're major, they're dangerous, they're risky, and what these men and women do every day on our roads for Georgia and for drivers is huge. And so we want to make sure that our folks are ready to be back out there when they are, and that's when we'll begin to resume that service. And lastly, I just want to give a special thanks to HERO leadership for the work they've been doing, both in times of thin staff and what they've done to bring the operator numbers back up. GDOT HR and, of course, GDOT leadership and the board for their support for this crucial and important program for the department. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions you all have.
Yep.
Exciting to see those trucks back on the road.
Very much so, agree.
You trying to get a 125?
Sorry, sir?
You trying to get a 125?
125 is our target. That's where we feel like we have stability within the unit to deal with any ebb and flow of staff that happens with any organization. But that we feel is our strong target to deliver the service we need to.
Okay. Very good. Any more questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Alan, thank you so much. I think this is an incredible program. It provides tremendous help for drivers all over the state. I would be interested, you said of the 81, you try to recruit, or at least it would be welcome, retired law enforcement. How many of the 81, how many of those do we know, or at another time offline, are retired law enforcement officials?
Yeah, so I don't know the number off the top of my head.
Yeah, no worries.
I can get it for you. We have a number of retired fire, military, law enforcement. For years, that had been a great pool of resources for us to recruit from. Of course, those agencies have had their own recruitment and retention issues as well over time, but there's a certain bit of a person it takes to do this kind of job, and a lot of time it's law enforcement and fire and things like that also have kind of that spirit within them to do this kind of work.
Absolutely.
So I can certainly get that information to you about the breakdown. We've recently had a lot of success in recruiting younger staff at a high school or technical trade college level. We've had a lot of our good operators come from that pool as well, but I'll be certainly to get those stats to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for what you do on that as well. It's a great program.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask the commissioner. You have a presentation you want us to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is not Thursday morning with a commissioner's report. It's a committee of the whole, so it's really an honor to speak to the committee of the whole and not give you the normal commissioner's report, because I felt like what I wanted to share today would take longer than you'd want to endure tomorrow. So we'll move ahead and start with my committee presentation that I affectionately call Back to the Future. And if you're a certain age, maybe around my age, you might remember the 1985 movie of Back to the Future, where Doc Brown developed his DeLorean time machine that you could go back to the future, come to the present, or come to the present and then go out to the future. So you could go back in time, to the present, to the future, all in a DeLorean time machine in 1985. Times were good. So y'all remember that? Are y'all awake? All right. All right.
Scott.
Yeah. So here's my roadmap. I intend to take us back a decade or so in the DeLorean. We're going to come back to where we are today here at the end of 2023, almost 2024. And of course, we're going to go out into the future, and we're going to set the dials in the DeLorean to the year 2050. Sounds like a long time away, but it's not. And as we travel through time, I'm going to pull information from board committee presentations that you've seen this year and put all this together in our time travel. So if you're ready, we're going to buckle up and we're going to jump back to the year 2010. Woo, it seems like a long time ago. So 13 years ago. And as you remember, in advance of 2010, in transportation, things were not going very swimmingly. We knew, and at the time, Governor Perdue recognized that we needed to make more investment in transportation for Georgia. And as such, the Transportation Investment Act of 2010 was born, that went to referendum in July of 2012. Now, you have seen TIA presentations repeatedly, but we have to remember there was 12 regions around the state that voted in July, and we had the 3 that passed, and you know the history of that well. Not only did they pass, a decade has elapsed, and those 3 have signed up for another 10 years, and plus we added South Georgia along the way, who is now working to work on the next decade. So what a great investment that has been for that 1% sales tax dedicated to transportation, and what a difference that made and then. So if we change our DeLorean and move the dial up to 2015, we jumped into the Transportation Funding Act of 2015, which is now 9 years ago. My gosh, that seems like just yesterday. And as you recall, out of the Transportation Funding Act of 2015, the goal was to try to generate an additional $1 billion of funding to move the department ahead. And as such, that did pass, right? I can remember standing in the well at Joint Appropriations that year, telling the Joint Appropriations Committee that, yes, we're aware that the downtown connector right out the window is falling apart. We acknowledge that. We just didn't have the funding to repair it. So time moves on, and we forget the situation that we were in. Our state of good repair was going downhill. Our bridges, we were posting more bridges, and bridges is in worse shape, and our pavements were in worse shape, and we certainly weren't doing many capacity type projects. It was not a great time prior to 2015. For many of you that were not on the board at that time, it was not some of the best of times, as I like to call it. But that legislation passed in 2015. There's the headline on the slide. That was from April of 2015, and that passed. That $1 billion of additional funding was solely focused on state of good repair. And at the time, there was different markers. $1 billion was state of good repair. $2 billion got you more growth, more capacity projects, and it went on up to about $4 billion back then was the forecast. But the $1 billion was focused on state of good repair, which we call foundational investments now. Safety, pavements, and bridges, taking care of what we own, taking care of the house, as I always like to call it. And, I think we've done pretty good job since then in bringing conditions back up to state of good repair and continuing to replace bridges and continuing to work on safety. So I feel like we've got in a pretty good spot, but you have to continue to invest to keep that flywheel moving. You got to keep investing to keep the state of good repair, because every piece of infrastructure is like every one of us. We all have a birthday and we get a little older, and there's another element that we may have to deal with, at least if you're like me. So we have to remember that $1 billion was really focused on state of good repair. So we're doing pretty good there. Now, we've continued to try to leverage that $1 billion to the maximum extent we can to take on some really big initiatives like the Major Mobility Investment Program. And you just heard from Tim Matthews about State Route 400, which is one of these projects on there. When I say we're leveraging these programs to do the East Interchange under construction now, some $870 million, the West Interchange under procurement now, which is around $1 billion-ish, we're looking to the private sector to finance those projects. Again, we're leveraging our money so we can pay them back over time, and we don't incur the debt as DOT or the state. And like Tim's presentation on the express lanes, where the tolling happens, then we're trying to optimize our public funding and let private funding come in, because they're able to cover capital costs or CapEx operational costs by the tolls. So that's where we're optimizing a public-private partnership, letting the private sector bring those innovations that Tim talked about, and again, to optimize the public funding or shrink the public funding as you can to leverage to provide congestion relief options for the people on 400, and next calendar year we'll tee up 285 and start that process of looking at express lanes on 285. Of course, we've done other amazing things like widening of Interstate 85 to the northeast, where there's so much freight growth and industrial manufacturing growth up toward commerce. So we've tried to leverage those dollars. In fact, when you look at around the Port of Savannah, which is a economic engine for this entire state and southeast region as well, there are 11 projects on this slide that go back to around 2014, 2015. So we're looking back about 10 years or so, maybe a little more, at 11 projects on this slide that total over $700 million of investment down in and around the port. And you can see the UC means under construction, but you can see how many other things that have been open to traffic, like the Jimmy DeLoach Parkway, the Jimmy DeLoach Parkway extension, State Route 21 at I-95. The list goes on and on. Two projects not shown here that are currently under construction is the Houlihan Bridge, which is a $95 million project that's under construction now to be completed in 2025. In Brampton Road, which is sort of about 3 o'clock on the clock dial that says UC, a little $127 million port access project that's about 47% complete that goes all the way into 2027. We've continued to invest, though, and as we look at where we are today, we continue to help these economic development projects. This was a slide that Andrew Heath showed you just a few months ago when we were out at OMAT for the committee meeting. This is the work that is associated with the Hyundai Kia Genesis Metaplan in Bryan County, a $265 million investment for frontage roads, upgrading the existing US 280, and ultimately building a new interchange there. Of course, as you know, we're under contract for the frontage road and we're under contract for the US 280, and we'll bid the interchange in July 2024. And just in case you haven't flown by there recently, you can see the progress with the Metasite that's going on. And I remind you that the governor and Hyundai signed the agreement in May of 2022. Look at that photo. May of 2022, there was nothing there. You can see the progress is amazing. And of course, just last month, you got an update from Andrew Hagnig with the CMGC cable replacement project for the Talmadge Bridge, where we're replacing the cables. We'll be replacing the cables on the Talmadge Bridge in Savannah. And when we do so, we're going to try to go ahead and lift up the bridge deck to allow more air draft, the space between the water and the bottom of the bridge deck. As I'm reminded, which makes me feel a little bit old, this bridge structure is now 32 years old, and I happened to go down there and work on it, or not work on it, happened to tour it when I was starting my career. Brad Saxon worked on that as a GDOT employee, so Brad and I are dating ourselves. The project was designed in the 1980s, as Andrew mentioned to you guys last month, and it opened to traffic in 1991. Now, at the very bottom of this slide is the ship of the day. So around 1988, the ships that were designed were 4,000 to 6,000 TEUs. Today's ships are 23,000 TEUs. So it was a design of the time, which had plenty of elevation, but now the ships have outpaced that air draft. So we're very excited to work on that project. $170 million pursuit in there. And of course, whoa, I lost a slide. Okay, something's missing. That's okay. It was going to be a great picture of the Rivian work that's at the East Atlanta Megasite, which is another economic development project. Is Rivian is now have the site graded and will start their construction. All three of these economic development projects, Hyundai, the Talmadge Bridge, and Rivian, total about a $650 million investment over about 2.5 budget years. And I remember Mr. McIntyre asking the question, well, where did that money come from? Well, it comes out of our budget. So that was a great question you asked when we were at OMAT. All right, so we've been in our DeLorean, and we're just still right here back in 2023. And I always like to take stock of how are we doing. So how are we doing? Well, as Georgia goes, this comes from economic development. We've continued to shatter our trade records. 40% growth in trade from Georgia over the last 5 years. That's an exceptional amount of growth, 47 billion in exports and 196 billion in total trade. All that trade happens along transportation networks, most of it on roads and bridges that we operate and maintain. Now, as you know, I'm sort of proud of GDOT. I do believe we're the best DOT in this nation, but you don't have to take it from me. As you recall, I showed you this before, that CNBC ranked Georgia having the best infrastructure. And they look at everything. They look at, obviously, Hartsfield-Jackson International. They look at the ports. They look at our roadways and bridges. And one of the bigger things, if you read the fine print, is conditions of roadway conditions. And that's why that Transportation Investment Act of 2015 was so important. They look at other things like utilities and water and all the things that are important, but infrastructure and transportation is the key component of that. Now, also, don't have to take it from me. As I've informed you, Georgia has been named the #1 state to do business now for 10 years in a row. I'm actually obligated to say that every time I get a chance. So, and I hope you do the same. Something to be very proud of. And if you look at the list, you can see the rankings. And I want you to freeze that in your mind a little bit. Look at those states that who we're competing against for being #1. This is from Site Selection Magazine. So the folks that look at what's the economic climate for business development. So this is who gives us this ranking. Now, they have several criteria that get you the ranking. Infrastructure and transportation is one of those categories. And so guess what? We scored #1 in that one also. So you look at the states, that's who we're competing against, and we scored #1 in that category for logistics and infrastructure. So very proud of that as well. Now, we got the DeLorean all warmed up. We're going to turn the dial to 2050 and prepare for the future. Now, I suggest to you that if you think about 2050, and if it seems like a long time away, we're within a year of being the same distance from 1999 as we are to the year 2050. Think about that for a moment. I was worried if my fax machine was going to work in 1990 or 2000, right? We were worried about a lot of things in 2000. If your fax machine was going to work, we worried about traffic signals for a little bit. And at 12:01 p.m. in Athens, Georgia, I said, my traffic signals are working good. I'm going home. So 2050 will be here quickly. And let me give you some perspective on that. The projects that we build and develop take a long time. Literally take a decade to do decent sized projects. Sometimes it takes longer. If we go fast, unless it's just like widening the Interstate 85, we can go pretty fast at those things where you don't have to buy right away. You can just move to the middle. You can go pretty fast. But if you've got to buy right away, you've got to go through more stringent environmental processes. It's easy a decade to do big things, and a decade's sort of fast. So just give you that perspective. So as we think about 2050 being, 26 years off, a decade to go by in a hurry before we make big investments. So as we prepare for the future, you saw this back in January from our freight and logistics plan that the planning division brought forward. A great job partnering with private sector and having freight advisory groups that tell us what's important to them from a business point of view. So very focused on what are the business outcomes important to all these companies that are in the logistics business. And this is what they told us, and you saw this slide back in January. The main KPIs are safety, reliability, speed, cost, and risk. And if we can address those, business said if we can address those in preparing for the future, it drives down the cost. And if it drives down their cost, it drives down consumer costs. So very much related. And the planning team used, I know well over 20, maybe over 30 data sets that are publicly available and privately available, such as data sets you get from logistics industries and trucking companies and things like that, so we can get some really detailed information about Georgia. And what we saw when we projected to 2050 is this slide. On the left, the two bar charts show you the tonnage back to 2015. We went back to pre-COVID, so we sort of knew things were stable. And then we projected to 2050. And this is the increased tonnage that will be moved on rail and on road. So if you do the math, it's a 91% increase in tonnage that will be moved from, as compared to 2015, 26 years in the future. So for practical purpose, say it basically doubles. So if you see a truck today, think another truck there. If you see a train, double that train, because that's basically what's going to happen. In fact, truck haul tonnage grows by 96%. Rail tonnage grows about 69%. When you look at it, it doesn't grow quite as much, but it continues to grow. So the right side now, and let me take this is deep dive. You're going to get credit for continuing education and all that for paying attention to these slides. But if you look at that right slide, this is the cost of congestion. David Haynes mentioned that, and he had that in his slide a minute ago from the ARC. Cost of congestion daily in Georgia in 2015 was $14.4 million cost of congestion to agribusiness, distribution, manufacturing, and other industries. That's not personal. That's not your and my time sitting in cars. That's just business related. When you look out to 2050, we see that it will more than double at $33 million per day. That's a 131% increase to cost of doing business due to congestion. The colors, I know it's probably hard to read. The dark blue is manufacturing. The light blue is distribution. Dark green is food and ag. Lighter green are the smaller other industries. But that just shows you our 2050, what our 2050 may look like. Which, if you think about every time you see a truck or a train, think about that doubling. That'll give you some perspective. Now, with that data, planning was able to do some amazing things. They're looking at manufacturing as a commodity, and you know that I just showed you the Hyundai, the Rivian. There's other things that you saw this year, like Archer Aviation out in Covenant, Georgia, to build an advanced air mobility aircraft. We're seeing manufacturing expected to grow by 77% by the year of 2050. And if you look at this map, each county has a color. The darker the color, the more tons, or actually thousands of tons of manufactured goods are in that county. If you see a triangle, that means that that county is growing in the top quartile of growth out to the year 2050. So we know where the growth is happening and where it's expected to grow. And I suggest too, I know Ann and I talked about this, the effect of Hyundai and Rivian are not represented probably accurately on this because this is a bigger model than a micro level model. Now, Georgia on the right, and when you see the blue lines, this is data set from 2019 showing where freight was flowing in Georgia. So these are the routes that freight are flowing on, and they're like you would expect on the interstates predominantly. But you can see where freight is flowing. You can see where manufacturing freight was not flowing. So it's sort of neat to say, if we know where the growth is happening and we know where the freight is flowing, that's how we plan for the future. We know where to make those investments. The next slide is strong agricultural growth. We see at 43% growth. Same thing, the darker the county, the more tons or thousands of tons of ag products grown in those counties. And again, the Georgia on the right shows you where the agricultural flows. And if you notice, they're different. The maps are different. There are overlaps, and I'll show you that in a moment. But as you can see in southwest Georgia and sort of northeast and northwest Georgia, you see more ag than you do sort of in east central Georgia. But we see 43% growth. So if 77% growth and 43% growth doesn't get your attention, let's talk about warehouse distribution on this next slide. We see 276% growth in warehouse distribution out to the year 2050. That is insane. That's a tremendous amount of growth. We heard just recently from a study that I'll mention later that the warehouse distribution in Savannah will double in 10 years. So think about that. So this is tremendous growth. So if you see warehouses popping up all around you, yep, that's it. And because part of that is definitely tied to the change in supply chain and how that works, and also because all of us are still ordering everything online. You may be ordering something right now, but I'm not looking. Go ahead, hit buy. All right. The right side of this chart is the value of those goods that are warehoused. So this is not congestion, but If you look at this, today there's $176 billion of value being warehoused in Georgia. By the year 2050 goes to $623 billion of value to be warehoused because it's more, and that outpaces the actual growth. So a lot of growth. All right, so I've talked about movies today. This is where you put those old 3D glasses on. You remember the 3D glasses? On this next chart, because this is where we've taken manufacturing, distribution, and food and agriculture, where it flows, and stacked them all on top of each other. So if you see the fatter the line, the wider the line, the more colors of the line, that means that you have manufacturing, distribution, and food and agriculture all traveling on those routes. If you look at I-16 coming out of Savannah, it is as wide as I-75 is north of Macon. And so you can see tremendous amount of freight moving in and out of the port. You can see I-95 thickens up, I-75, of course, I-85, I-20, you name the major interstates, but you can see some other U.S. routes, 441s, the U.S. 27s of the world, U.S. 84s, the State Route 133s. You can see a lot of overlap, and you get up into metro area north, and you can again see tremendous work up 75 and 575. Everybody has found where Emily lives. They know how great things are up there. So you can just see that there's a lot of overlap, and so this gives us perspective of how do we plan. How does Janine and the planning team plan the projects for the future? And as I mentioned, Savannah. You saw this just last month when Matt Markham gave a presentation on the Coastal Empire Study. Again, a great body of work that's really forward-looking out to the year 2050. And he showed you these maps. I just tell you, green is good, red is bad. So this is what 2050 looks like with the ports. This is based on traffic originating or arriving at the Port of Savannah. So this is what the future looks like with all that growth that's going on there, without some investment. And this one, I'm going to take just a minute. I think you saw this one again last month. I was, again, not with you last month, but I think you saw this one as well. And spend a little time on this. It's complicated. And you always got to read the fine print, right, first. The slide on the left are the 4 counties, Chatham, Effingham, Bryan, and Bullitt counties. These are travel times from the Port of Savannah, which is that little hook. How long does it take you, basically in 2020, to travel from the Port of Savannah? And as you look at the darkest blue on that side, it's under 60 minutes. I didn't have my glasses didn't work for that. I had to get close to it. So the light blue in Bullitt County, Statesboro, northern Bullitt County, you can leave the port and be to that point in 60 minutes or so. Right, Ann? That's about right. So in 2050, the dark blue is greater than 2 hours. So you won't be able to get from the Port of Savannah to Bullitt County and Statesboro. It will take you 2 hours. You can do that in less than 60 minutes today. And if you look, that darker blue cascade, so it's going to take you more than an hour to get even into Effingham County and part of Bryan County, the west side of Bryan County. So you can see the tremendous growth that's happening in the Savannah, Greater Coastal Empire, as we called it, 4 counties there. So what does this mean? That means less than 5% of the industrial space would be in a 20-minute drive. A 20-minute drive from the port today, you can get pretty far. 40% of the available industrial space now that's there today would be more than an hour away. And that's not something you want to be. And so what Matt showed you was they came up with 23 major projects, 12 corridor projects, 11 intersection projects that help tremendously. In fact, with these 23 projects, you can see that 93% of the planned industrial development would be within an hour. Notice that, not 100%, only 93%. And if you don't do that, only 57% would be in an hour, 43% would be over an hour. And you can see a 58% reduction in vehicle delay cost that we just talked about. What does all that cost you? $1.4 billion plus of investment for 23 projects. So that's pretty significant. And I say plus because those are planning level numbers, probably not adjusted for inflation and the like. So if you look at this freight plan statewide, what does it really take to advance and to get to the future that we want? Well, we think that will take at least an $81 billion investment over the next 26 years to get to where we know that we want to be for Georgia. We also estimate that there's about $55 billion of projects that's not even in our pipeline yet, that things that we identified here that have yet to have been programmed to put in our work plan or even get started on. If you annualize that, that could be a number as high as $3.6 billion a year to work on freight. I remind you that our total budget is about $4.2 billion. And these are just the freight type projects. So as you can see, our freight future is growing very fast. And I put estimated on this slide. I want to be very clear. This is more of an order of magnitude slide than a precise slide, because when you've got over $55 billion of projects that you haven't identified yet, we haven't done cost estimates. We're using some large estimates here on, base it per mile cost, those kind of things. So this slide it just gives you an order of magnitude. There's a lot to be done. So while we're here in the present, it's one of my favorite sayings. It's said of leadership that one must first acknowledge his or her reality. It is said of leadership that one must first acknowledge his or her realities. And back in October, Eric Rohde gave you a presentation about the realities of what our projects are now costing. He looked back to December of 2020 and projected to the October of 23 on what our costs were. Well, we saw resurfacing costing now about 80% more, 80 to 90% more. Bridge costs are about 61% more. Roundabouts were 114% more. And widening projects are 118% more than they were in 2020. And I remind you that urban widening projects are averaging construction cost $18 million a mile. So think about that. So we're acknowledging that reality that things are just costing significantly more. And the chart on the right is you get technical points and credit for this as well. This is a chart that has the Power Producer Index. Dennis, you may be familiar with that. Has an Employment Cost Index. It has the Consumer Price Index. And really importantly, the red line is the National Highway Construction Cost Index, which indexes things like asphalt, concrete, steel, electrical wiring, things like that, the commodities that drive highway construction cost. That comes from Federal Highway. So Federal Highway tracks that information. What all the lines are, pay attention to the red line and the blue line at the bottom of the orange on the right. So our revenue is indexed to CPI, which is fantastic. So if you think about our budget, it's indexed to Consumer Price Index. But you can see that's the bottom blue line. The top line is what we're actually experiencing in construction cost. This is national data, it's not Georgia data. So the difference is the cost versus the revenues. Simply put, is projects are costing much more now. With the revenue that we have, we're not going to be able to deliver the same amount of projects. We're going to do less projects because they cost more. A very complicated graph to show you that point, is that's the reality you are. Now, you might say, and you heard David Haynes just talk about in the 20-county area about how many billions of dollars they have. That is true. And the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, truly was the most historic funding initiative, transportation infrastructure funding initiative in our nation's history. It was 20% the first year, 22% increase the second year, 24% the next year. And we're seeing prices 60, 100, 60%, 40%, 80%, 118% higher than what we budgeted for. So that buying power, as he said, has just been eroded. But thank goodness for it, because otherwise I really wouldn't be standing here talking to you today. So it's kept our head at sort of water level. So that's acknowledging realities. Acknowledging the other realities, you approved the State Transportation Improvement Program that we call the STIP. David presented the TIP, which is the MPO's 4-year plan. You approved the next 4 fiscal years for the STIP. And I remind you that, as David said, you have to be physically constrained. So whatever the federal funding is and whatever the funding amounts are for the next 4 years of the forecast, you have to build a financial model. With everything costing more, then we have to move projects further out. So we had to move projects out of the STIP to make room for the increased cost, because every year we update project cost estimates. It's like building a house. You're gonna start with a set of plans at one cost, and then as time goes on, you continue to update what your actual costs are. So we're always updating our project cost estimates, which means we've had to move a lot of projects out of the next 4 years to make room for the increased budgets. So as we look to the future, I want to make sure to share this, because who doesn't like a great sports analogy? And if you remember back to that slide I talked to you about the number one state to do business, and I said, remember those states, right, that were on that list? It reminds me of Coach Prime when he went to Colorado, and his motto was, "We're coming." And he was telling everybody, "We're coming." Those states, number 2 through 10, are coming for Georgia. Let me share that with you. They want to be where we are. This table shows our per capita investment by state. It shows our annual budgets, state and federal, and then it shows what those states' general assemblies gave to those DOTs in surplus revenue funds on top of their base budget. So if you can look to our friends to the south, Florida this year received a $4 billion surplus revenue to Florida DOT, and they identified a number of projects that they wanted to advance sooner than later. Tennessee, our neighbors to the north, had $3.3 billion in surplus funds to Tennessee DOT to be spent over the 3 regions of Tennessee DOT, with a focus of building express lanes in the greater Nashville area. Virginia, and I remind people, Virginia has less population than Georgia, and Georgia is bigger geographically. Their base budget is $8.1 billion, and they received $6.3 billion of general fund money this year. And my counterpart up there unapologetically says, we need every designer we can working in Virginia. And so I kick them in the shin every time I see them. Stephen, all right. And Mississippi, I put Mississippi on the list. So, we don't compete with Mississippi in much of anything, I don't think, no offense. But if you look at their per capita investment, but if you look at $620 million, their General Assembly appropriated $620 million to Mississippi DOT, and they're saying, look, we're advancing projects and we're not taking on debt, and we're not using federal dollars. They're going to separate themselves from federal government. They're pretty federally dependent in Mississippi, as we used to be back in before 2015. So they're saying, look, we're taking our surplus revenue and we're putting it into transportation to move ahead. So I just give you that as way of information, as now that you've been on the time machine ride going back to 2010, sort of see our evolution of funding, that we're in really good standing today, but looking out to a future that's really growing, and one that will be here before we know it when it comes to transportation speak. And I'll leave you with one of my favorite sayings. Some of you have seen this before. The future is not something we enter. The future is something we create. So I know that the House and the Senate has had many freight and logistics committees over the last few years, including an aviation committee. And so I know that this is on their minds, and I hope that they continue to take this information that we've had these presentations. Janine and I both have presented earlier this year to the House and Senate Transportation Committees about this expected growth that we intend to see from freight and logistics. So I look forward to entering the future that we all want for Georgia. So thank you for indulging me with your time, and I'll be glad to answer any questions or comments, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Questions for the commissioner?
Yes, sir, Mr. Boswell.
How do we move forward? All the other states around us, and there are only 2 states on that I remember were north of Tennessee. Everything else is south.
Right.
And we got a lot of competition, obviously, but I mean, where can the funds come from? Is it in charging to travel on the roads, or is it?
Well, I was educating you on how other states are addressing this, and those were surplus revenue. That's how other states recently are addressing doing more projects and then in addressing increased cost.
Any more questions?
Do we have surplus revenue?
Yeah.
The state, yes.
Yes. Is that what it was?
Jeff?
I'm just curious, besides us as a board, who else have you made this presentation to, or who else do you plan to present this to?
Thank you for that. I've spoken to the Georgia Chamber Board of Directors. The Chamber, Georgia Transportation Alliance is very aware of this. The Chamber and the Alliance certainly are advocating for increased investment in transportation because their communities are the ones benefiting from all these this manufacturing revolution across the whole state too. We talked a lot about Savannah today, but Dublin, Georgia has had 2 or 3 big announcements. Bainbridge has had a great announcement. Cartersville up in your neck of the woods has got 2 major announcements. One just opened, and so there's a lot going on across this entire state. I've spoken to the Cobb Chamber, a similar presentation, not the exact same presentation. Spoke to the Ports Authority just last week. Ann was there and gave a similar presentation, a little more focused on the port itself and around that area. So, and then again, sitting down with our transportation chairs in the coming weeks as we enter session, again, to share this information. I think it's very important. So, and as you have opportunities to talk to your House and Senate members, Kristen can provide this presentation and deck. If you want to go back to the future with them, that'd be fine.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. Do you think that we will be looking at potential legislation for appropriation or anything like that in this upcoming session or possibly the next session?
I would be optimistic that the House and Senate, I would be hopeful that they would consider such kind of actions. Obviously, it's through appropriations. It's not through our legislation.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Great.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Yeah. Any more questions, comment? Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.